Imagine standing on the bridge of a colossal human starship, staring down at an alien world, the first true test of our species' dominance beyond Earth. The year was 2167, and humanity had finally achieved what generations before could only dream of: interstellar colonization. The discovery of faster-than-light travel, or FTL, had shattered the chains of our solar system, allowing pioneers to stake claims in the vast emptiness of space. But while some saw these new frontiers as blank slates for human civilization, others saw them as battlegrounds, because we weren't alone. When the UN-backed colonial authority greenlit the first permanent off-world settlement, the target was a planet known as Epsilon Prime, a lush, Earth-like world orbiting the star. Epsilon Eridani. Initial surveys confirmed the planet was habitable, rich in resources, and a perfect candidate for human expansion. The first wave of colonists, mostly scientists and engineers, landed without incident. For months, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Then the disappearances began. Colonists went missing, their bodies never recovered. Communications relays were sabotaged. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. At first, people thought it was sabotage from rival human factions, but soon the truth emerged. Epsilon Prime wasn't uninhabited. A native species, dubbed the Zalari, had been watching us from the shadows. They weren't advanced like us. No starships, no artificial structures, but they were highly intelligent, fast, and above all, territorial. Humanity had done what it always did: claimed land without truly understanding its inhabitants. And the Zalari weren't about to surrender. They're home to alien invaders, which meant war was inevitable. At first, the colonial authority refused to escalate tensions. They sent diplomatic teams, hoping to establish communication. But the Zalari had no interest in negotiation. Instead, they responded with brutal efficiency, launching coordinated attacks on human settlements, destroying supply lines, and striking under the cover of night. The colonial authority was caught off guard. Our advanced technology meant nothing if we couldn't see our enemy coming. The war had begun, and humanity was losing. The first months of the war were a nightmare. Humanity had expected to dominate Epsilon Prime with superior firepower and advanced technology. Instead, our forces were blindsided by an enemy that didn't fight like any military we had ever faced. The Zalari were masters of guerrilla warfare, using their deep knowledge of the planet's terrain to their advantage. They struck from underground. Tunnels emerged from dense alien forests and dismantled our defenses before vanishing without a trace. Our motion sensors couldn't detect them. Our automated turrets wasted ammunition firing at empty jungle. And worst of all, our soldiers were demoralized. The Zalari had evolved for this planet. Their chameleon-like skin allowed them to blend perfectly with their surroundings. They could see in complete darkness and move through the dense foliage without making a sound. More than once, entire squads of human marines went missing, their bodies later found mutilated, sometimes with messages carved into their armor in an alien script we barely understood. The message was clear: leave or be erased. The UN colonial authority had underestimated the situation. They had assumed that any resistance from a pre-industrial species would crumble under superior firepower. But the Zalari didn't fight in open battles. They struck when we least expected it, sabotaging energy grids, poisoning water supplies, even infiltrating human bases to assassinate key leaders. The first governor of Epsilon Prime, Richard Henshaw, was found dead in his quarters, his throat slit with what appeared to be a sharpened piece of alien bone. Panic spread among the colonists. Families who had once dreamed of a new life among the stars now found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Entire settlements were abandoned as people fled to fortified bunkers, hoping for rescue. But no rescue was coming. Earth was too far away, and the colonial authority was too proud to admit failure. Instead, they doubled down. By 2168, humanity launched Operation Iron Veil, a full-scale military campaign to subjugate the Zalari by any means necessary. Warships in orbit rained down kinetic bombardments on suspected enemy strongholds, burning entire sections of the jungle to ash. Ground forces deployed experimental weapons, including sonic pulses designed to collapse Zalari tunnels. The philosophy was simple: if we couldn't outfight them, we'd outlast them. we'd make the planet unlivable for them. Before they did the same to us. But there was one problem. Epsilon Prime was starting to fight back. As the war dragged on, human scientists made a terrifying discovery. The planet itself, its ecosystem, its biosphere, was reacting to the destruction. Plants began releasing spores that corroded human machinery. Water sources turned toxic seemingly overnight. Even the air became more hostile, as pollen levels spiked, triggering allergic reactions that weakened human immune systems. It was as if the very land was rejecting us, and the Zalari knew exactly how to use it to their advantage. For the first time in history, humanity faced a war not just against an enemy species, but against an entire planet. And we were running out of time. By 2170, the war on Epsilon Prime had reached a critical point. The colonial authority had poured resources into the conflict, sending wave after wave of reinforcements. But despite their numbers, humanity was still losing ground. The Zalari weren't just surviving, they were adapting. They learned how to disable our drones, sabotage our supply chains, and even repurpose some of our stolen technology for their own use. For every human victory, the Zalari retaliated with brutal precision. Back on Earth, the war had become a political disaster. What had started as a promising colonial expansion had turned into a costly and humiliating struggle. Billions of credits had been spent on military operations, yet the death toll only continued to rise. Public outrage grew louder. Some called for a complete withdrawal, arguing that Epsilon Prime wasn't worth the cost. Others demanded that the colonial authority do whatever it took to secure the planet, no matter the ethical consequences. And that's when the unthinkable happened. In a last-ditch effort to turn the tide, human scientists developed the Genesis Protocol, a radical bioweapon engineered to selectively target Zalari physiology. The idea was simple: introduce a virus into the planet's ecosystem that would wipe out the native species while leaving humans unharmed. The project was classified at the highest levels, known only to the military's top brass and a handful of genetic engineers. The official justification was that the Zalari had left humanity no choice. It was us, or them. But before the Genesis virus could be deployed, word of the plan leaked. A whistleblower within the colonial authority sent encrypted transmissions to several human colonies, exposing the secret project. The revelation sent shockwaves throughout the Terran Federation. While some hardliners supported the bioweapons' use, others saw it as an act of genocide, something that could set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts. If humanity wiped out one species to claim a planet, what would stop us from doing it again? The backlash was immediate. Protesters on Earth took to the streets, demanding the war be brought to an end. Some of the colonies even refused to send further reinforcements, fearing they were being dragged into an ethical nightmare. The political pressure reached a boiling point, and the UN was forced to step in. They issued a direct order. Genesis was to be destroyed. But by then, it was too late. A rogue faction within the military, convinced that the only way to win was to finish what had been started, went against orders. In secret, they deployed a small, controlled release of the virus in a remote region of Epsilon Prime. Within weeks, entire Zalari populations began to die. It seemed like humanity had finally broken their resistance. Until the unexpected happened. The virus mutated. Instead of only attacking the Zalari, it began spreading uncontrollably, affecting the entire ecosystem. Plants wilted, animals died en masse, and even the planet's atmosphere began to shift. Scientists quickly realized that the virus wasn't just wiping out the Zalari. It was killing Epsilon Prime itself. The planet's delicate balance had been thrown into chaos, and if it wasn't stopped, it would soon become completely uninhabitable. Now, humanity had a choice to make. Did we continue our conquest, knowing that we might be left with a dead world? Or did we try to fix what we had broken, even if it meant losing everything? The moment humanity unleashed the Genesis virus, Epsilon Prime began to die. What had once been a lush, vibrant world teeming with alien life now rotted under our influence. The virus, designed to target Zalari biology, proved to be far more unpredictable than expected. It spread through the food chain, infecting not only the native species but also the planet's entire biosphere. Within months, massive swaths of jungle had turned into wastelands, Rivers dried up. The sky itself darkened, choked with strange, toxic particles released by decaying plant life. At first, the colonial authority tried to contain the outbreak. Quarantine zones were established, and high-ranking officials reassured the public that the situation was under control. But the truth was undeniable. Epsilon Prime was collapsing. The once hospitable atmosphere was rapidly becoming poisonous, forcing even human forces to retreat to pressurized shelters. Worst of all, the Zalari, who had fought so hard to defend their home, were now fleeing in desperation. The proud warriors who had resisted our invasion for years were now nothing more than refugees, scattered across the dying planet with nowhere left to run. It was a grim victory. Humanity had won the war, but at a devastating cost. The colonial authority now faced an impossible dilemma: stay and attempt to terraform the broken world, or abandon Epsilon Prime entirely. The planet's resources, which had once been the primary motivation for colonization, were now contaminated by biological decay. Even our most advanced terraforming technology struggled to keep pace with the damage. Then, something even more terrifying happened. The virus began to mutate again. This time, it wasn't just affecting Epsilon Prime, it was adapting to human DNA. Soldiers stationed on the surface started developing strange symptoms. Their skin reacted violently to the planet's air, their lungs struggled to process oxygen, and some even exhibited neurological breakdowns. It became clear that the longer we stayed, the more we risked becoming the next victims of our own creation. Earth received the grim reports with horror. The politicians who had once demanded victory at any cost were now the first to push for evacuation. Within weeks, orders were given. Epsilon Prime was to be abandoned. The war was over, not because we had conquered the planet, but because we had destroyed it beyond repair. The withdrawal was a nightmare. Human forces scrambled to leave the surface before they too succumbed to the virus. Colonists, who had once dreamed of building new lives on Epsilon Prime, were now forced to watch as their homes crumbled around them. Those who had invested their entire future into the colony were left with nothing. And as for the Zalari, what few remained were left to their fate. Some historians would later call it the greatest tragedy of human expansion. Others called it a necessary lesson, proof that not every world was meant to be ours. But one thing was certain: the first human colony war had forever changed the course of interstellar history, and humanity was left to wonder, was this truly a victory, or the greatest mistake we had ever made? The last human warships lifted off from Epsilon Prime in 2172, leaving behind a dying world that had once held so much promise. From orbit, the planet no longer resembled the lush paradise humanity had fought so hard to claim. Its skies were thick with swirling clouds of dust and toxins. The jungles that had once teemed with life were now blackened husks. The great rivers, which had been the lifeblood of the Zalari, had become stagnant pools of poison. The official reports labeled the war a strategic success. Humanity had defeated the Zalari, driven them to the brink of extinction, and ensured that no alien species would ever threaten a human colony again. But behind closed doors, military leaders and politicians knew the truth. We had lost far more than we had gained. The economic cost of the war was astronomical. The resources spent on the invasion, the prolonged conflict, and the evacuation had drained the coffers of the colonial authority. What was meant to be humanity's greatest expansion project had instead crippled future colonization efforts. Investors pulled out of other planetary projects, fearing another costly disaster. Politicians who had once championed the conquest of Epsilon Prime now distanced themselves from the war, calling it a tragic miscalculation. And then there was the human toll. Over 600,000 soldiers and colonists had died, not just in battle, but from starvation, disease, and exposure to the virus we had unleashed. Those who had survived bore deep psychological scars. The soldiers who had fought in the trenches of Epsilon Prime spoke of an enemy that was never truly defeated, of a planet that had resisted them at every turn. Many were left haunted by what they had done. The destruction of an entire civilization, the extermination of a species that had only been defending its home. But the greatest consequence of all was what followed after the war. News of the Genesis Protocol's deployment sent shockwaves through the rest of human space. Other alien civilizations even those that had remained neutral in our expansion, now saw humanity as a species willing to use biological warfare to achieve its goals. Diplomatic relations with the few alien nations we had encountered became strained. Some began arming themselves, preparing for the possibility that they might be next. The fear of humanity spread across the stars. Back on Earth, the controversy surrounding Epsilon Prime shattered public trust in the colonial authority. Investigations revealed the full extent of the cover-ups, the lies told to justify the war, the reckless deployment of the virus, the disastrous evacuation. Protests erupted across human colonies, demanding accountability. In 2175, the UN formally dissolved the colonial authority, replacing it with a new governing body meant to ensure that no such catastrophe would ever happen again. But even as humanity tried to move forward, the ghosts of Epsilon Prime refused to be forgotten. For years, the abandoned planet remained a symbol of arrogance, of unchecked ambition, of the dangers of underestimating the unknown. Stories spread of Zalari survivors, small groups that had somehow endured the virus, eking out a desperate existence in the wastelands. Some believed they had fled underground, waiting for the day they could reclaim their home. Others whispered of something even darker, that the planet itself was changing, adapting, evolving into something new. Humanity had left Epsilon Prime behind. But had Epsilon Prime truly let us go? For decades after the war, Epsilon Prime remained a forbidden world. Officially, it was classified as an environmental hazard zone, marked by the lingering effects of the Genesis virus. But the real reason no one returned was fear. Fear of what we had done, and fear of what we might find if we went back. The Yadi, few reconnaissance missions that dared to approach the planet reported strange anomalies. Scans detected unusual energy signatures, patterns that defied natural geological formations. Satellite imagery captured glimpses of structures deep within, the abandoned cities, structures that hadn't been there before. And then there were the distress signals. Garbled, fragmented transmissions that echoed across the system, sometimes resembling human voices, sometimes something else entirely. Many dismissed these reports as sensor errors or remnants of old signals bouncing through the planet's decaying atmosphere. But others weren't so sure. Among the most disturbing findings were signs that something had survived. Deep scanning probes detected movement, fast, coordinated, and intelligent. No known human technology remained on the surface, yet something was rebuilding. The Zalari should have been extinct, their entire species wiped out by the Genesis virus. But had they found a way to adapt? Had some hidden faction escaped underground, waiting for the right moment to rise again? Rumors spread across human space. Some whispered that the Zalari had evolved beyond their original forms, twisted by the virus into something more dangerous than before. Others feared that Epsilon Prime had become a graveyard of ghosts, a world cursed by the echoes of the war, where something unnatural stirred beneath the ruins. There were even claims that the planet itself had begun to fight back, that the biosphere was recovering in a way no one could explain. Could the Genesis virus have triggered an accelerated mutation? Was Epsilon Prime changing into something we could no longer comprehend?